Well, I think that probably the most fundamental problem is the Liberal Party itself has been corrupted by the PRC's influence and rendered unto the Chinese state. And we've had various Liberal members of Parliament, such as Han Dong and Paul Chang, be forced to resign due to their own intimate relationship with the PRC and the Chinese Communist Party.
There are two debates gaining serious traction right now in Canada: where criticism of Israel crosses the line into anti Semitism, and how real the threat of foreign interference, especially from China, actually is. Our next guest has written extensively on both. William Barclay is a political commentator, political strategist, policy expert, and columnist with the Western Standard and the American Spectator, and has participated in discussions at prestigious institutions around the world, such as Harvard and Oxford. He joined us today to unpack these questions, for which he has researched extensively. William, welcome to Northern Perspective.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here with you.
So you wrote an article for the National Post, "The Left's Unhealthy Obsession with Israel." What inspired you to write this article in the first place?
Well, for one, I myself am Jewish, right? So it's an issue that's very near and dear to my own heart. I've very much seen and experienced the explosion of anti-Semitism in Canada over the past, I don't know, say decade. And one of the things that really stuck out to me is that what we've seen is that really, although the left in Canada has long declared itself to be a champion of every beleaguered minority and all oppressed people, anti-Semitism has very much become a quintessential aspect or feature of the left. Very much every left-wing political party in Canada, to me, what really stuck out, what seemed to be evident, is that the reason for this was very much the advent and the onset of identity politics throughout the modern era. And so I felt that it was necessary for this issue to be brought to kind of the fore of Canadian politics and really exposed for what it is.
So your piece argues that in some cases, criticism of Israel has crossed a line into anti-Semitism in Canada, as you say. For a lot of the left-wing parties, such as the NDP and the Liberals, they have repeatedly and loudly criticized Israel. So there is a line where it crosses from criticism into anti-Semitism. So for you personally, where is that line?
Well, I think maybe what I'd say is that imagine the outcry that would erupt from all liberals, big L and small l alike, if even one individual Muslim person was violently attacked or a single mosque in Canada was surrounded by a hostile mob due to the fact that a terrorist organization claimed another innocent life in France or attempted to orchestrate another mass killing in the USA. It would be unimaginable, right? But this is the reality for Jewish communities all across Canada, and it's being tolerated again simply because individual innocent Jewish people in Canada have been rendered synonymous with the politics of the state of Israel and punished for its perceived sins. And that's just simply not okay, though it is, again, the macabre reality for Jewish people all across Canada.
And is this isolated to just the leaders of these movements? Because there is a danger, if we're being completely honest, in almost practicing the same identity politics that the left loves to practice, in grouping everybody that may identify themselves as a liberal or New Democrat into this group of people that are espousing these anti-Semitic statements. So how do we manage that?
Well, there's obviously a line, kind of, there's legitimate criticism, right? But I would point out that Anthony Housefather himself, a Jewish member of parliament, a relatively prominent one for the Liberals, actually nearly quit the Liberal Party altogether as a result of the Liberal government's overtly anti-Israel policies and utter unwillingness to confront anti-Semitism in Canada post-October 7th. And I think that's very much where we can look. The parties themselves have been condemned by these, let's say, bright spots within their fold. I mean, even the Green Party itself, you had Annemie Paul, the former leader, as well as the party's former president, Paul Estrin, who were forced to quit the party because anti-Semitism and Jew hatred had become so commonplace within the party. I mean, Estrin labeled the party as the anti-Semitic wolves washed in green, right? And so there are certainly bright spots within the parties, like the Green Party, the NDP, and the Liberal Party. But in a way, they all seem to have either departed or been on the verge of departing, and at the very least have strongly criticized the parties. What we've seen in contrast, though, on the right, let's say at least with the Conservative Party, is we've seen numerous members of the Conservative Party take very strong stances against, let's say, overt anti-Semitism and Jew hatred in Canada, and that's something that we simply haven't seen from the leadership in the Liberal Party, at least, in any capacity. We've seen the Liberal leadership actually condemn the state of Israel and very much the Jewish people for atrocities that simply didn't happen.
And You mentioned Anthony Housefather. He, as you probably know, he helped pen a letter that he wanted all of the Liberal Party to sign. That it it was pretty straightforward, I think. It was just to condemn anti-Semitism, and only 20% of their entire caucus actually signed it. What does that say to you, and how does that actually match what you're saying in this article?
Okay, well, how about this? Hamas themselves has glibly thanked the liberal government for its stalwart support in the struggle against the Jews on multiple occasions. I think that says all we need to say. I mean, the liberal MP Bill Casey actually said himself it's not anti Semitic or uncommon for Jews around the world to now be showing scorn and disrespect in the hope that this message will reach the Netanyahu government. That's crazy. Right? I think it's simply unacceptable that we have Hamas thanking our sitting government for their support, and we have former Liberal MPs essentially saying, hey, what's happening to innocent Jews and communities across Canada is okay because Netanyahu, who will take note. I think that, like you were saying, Anthony Housefather penned this note, and the Liberal Party simply failed to answer. And that's a lot of what we've seen over the past 10 years.
Now, one of the events that actually happened, and I'm sure you're well aware of this, Canadians are well aware of this, is the Liberal government and Mark Carney gave Hamas a condition in order to recognize their state, or recognize Palestine as an actual state. And then Hamas actually didn't fulfill any conditions at all, at which point Canada and other countries around the world recognized the state of Palestine. How do you think liberals like Anthony Housefather and other supportive Jews on the left, how do you think they reconcile with what their party is doing versus what is actually happening in the world, and recognizing a terrorist state as a state?
Well, I think everybody has priorities, right? And I think that Anthony Housefather, at least, has shown where his priorities lie. I mean, they're with the Liberal Party. He was on the verge of quitting, and he didn't. And I would wager that the Liberal Party's anti-Israel stance hasn't necessarily improved. Like you were saying, Mark Carney actually emboldened Hamas and various terrorist organizations by lending them so much support and refusing to condemn them when they didn't fulfill these conditions. And so I don't really know personally, if I was a Liberal MP, how I would be able to reconcile my party's stance and kind of overt, I don't want to say hatred of the state of Israel, right? But they don't like them very much. I wouldn't be able to reconcile that with my own personal faith and just never mind my faith as a Jewish person, but kind of my beliefs as a Canadian who believes in democracy and the rule of law. I mean, until another state is erected in the Middle East, perhaps Iran post America, we don't know. Again, Israel is very much the only pole of democracy and human rights in the Middle East, and very much where beleaguered peoples from other states flee to, right? So I wouldn't be able to reconcile the party's position with my own personal ethics, quite frankly.
And there's obviously a rise in anti-Semitic violence around Canada. That is undisputed. There were shootings in Toronto around the U.S. consulate, and that forced the Israeli embassy in Ottawa to close for a time because of the concern. There's police that are now regularly stationed around all of the Jewish religious sites around Canada, so they can practice their faith. What specific actions, I would say, outside of Mark Carney and the Liberals recognizing Palestine, what rhetoric, what government policies do you think is actually feeding this rise in anti-Semitic violence?
Well, it's simply not being prosecuted. I think there's always, like, I'll compare it to taxes for a second, right? Like every year we hear about new, I don't know, procedures, new strategies to kind of extract taxation from the rich to get people to pay their fair share, et cetera, right? And quite frankly, like what we need people to do is just simply follow the rules that we already have, right? With regards to taxes, right? All these new rules are kind of moot if nobody follows them. It's the same thing with regards to anti-Semitism in Canada. We can discuss every year kind of what new legislation, what new policies or politics might curb anti-Semitism in Canada, but quite simply put, the government is not prosecuting people who break the law. We've had these protests menace Jewish communities for I think years now, right? I think Toronto had over 300 protests march through its neighborhoods, and the government is allowing it to happen. The government is allowing violent pro-Palestinian protests and extremists to flout Canadian law, endanger innocent Jewish lives, and I think they've noticed this. I think they've noticed that these catch and release politics, the justice system, has allowed them to simply do what they want, and they have become emboldened here in Canada because they can act with impunity. And I think this is kind of a message that's very much trickled down and being disseminated amongst their ranks.
Now, I think even the someone being objective could say, there is room for criticism of Israel's policies right now, but would you agree that that's a completely separate discussion than day to day Jews living in Canada just trying to go about their lives? Like whatever the actions of Israel doesn't justify any response, any negative response to any of the Jews living in Canada. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. Like I was saying before, I think that the Jewish people in Canada are being rendered synonymous with the politics of the state of Israel, and they're very much being punished for it here in real time. And I think very much what we've seen is the modern advent of identity politics in Canada, and on the left in particular. Well, it's rendered the legitimacy of any person or people's social plight or perspective contingent upon their ability to immediately exhibit the requisite diversity criteria and intersectional location on the spectrum of identity. And unfortunately, the Jewish people have been routinely misconstrued and misunderstood as a rich white homogenous mass throughout the modern era. And as a result, the Jewish community's whiteness has functioned as the impetus for Canada's liberal politicians, very much everybody on the left, to deny the plight of the Jewish people and to disregard the severe outbreak of anti Semitic violence and terrorism that the Jewish community has been forced to endure over the past decade. I think even more so, you could say that the Jewish community's whiteness has been used to ensconce them as a source of socio-political malaise and a locus of oppression. And it's been leveraged in order to locate them as very much the oppressor of the Palestinian people and the de facto origin of the Israel-Palestine conflict altogether.
And do you think that the violence that we're seeing against the Jewish community and the anti Semitism, do you think that is organic, or do you think that is organized from some of these organizations out in the Middle East?
Oh, absolutely. I think they have a hand in it, right? Like I think that we know for a fact that the IRGC has been allowed to act with impunity in Canada. Hamas representatives, Hezbollah senior officials, it simply would be unfathomable to believe that they don't have some hand in currying these kinds of support and rallies. I think even the Palestinian youth movement itself is intimately linked to various terrorist organizations, both in the U.S. and internationally. And I think that it would be a little bit ignorant to believe that these organizations aren't lending these protesters extreme amounts of funding. I think it would be a little bit ignorant.
Now, this is always the danger from foreign powers when it comes to Canada because we have a track record, and CSIS has been very upfront about this and very honest about it, in that Canada is essentially open for business for foreign interference and foreign actors to commit either underhanded or overt malicious activity in Canada. And one of the other articles that you have written on this is about, well, our dangerous relationship with China now. Now, we have to be objective. China is one of the largest economies in the world. You have to do business with them, whether you like them or not. But just because you have to do business with them doesn't mean you trust them, and doesn't mean that you open your country to foreign interference with them. So, what is the danger right now with what Mark Carney and the Liberals are doing versus the relationship that, say, Stephen Harper and the previous Conservative government had with China?
Well, I think that it's clear that the past decade of liberal politics has rendered Canada's government subject to the PRC and transformed the Canadian nation into a bastion of Chinese influence in the West. I think it's fundamentally different than just doing business with them, right? I think more importantly, though, it's readily apparent that Canada's eager embrace of the PRC has not been at all freely given, never mind innocently received. No, for I think about over a decade, Canada's Liberal government, its prime ministers, have shamelessly forced the Canadian nation to casually sacrifice not merely its historic relationship with the U.S., but its pursuit of the very democratic ideal itself, in order to extract their own political gain and profit from the flesh of the Canadian people. And that's just not okay.
So, one of the things that we saw through the Hope Commission, and one of the things that we've seen from the CSIS whistleblowers and all of this information, unfortunately, trickling out of quiet government sources that eventually make it to the public is that the Chinese influence is almost at every level of government in Canada, whether it's municipal up to federal. And there seems to be a strong reluctance to acknowledge it, talk about it, never mind investigate it. So, what has to happen in Canada in order to reverse this tide of Chinese influence that is coming into Canada?
Well, I think that probably the most fundamental problem is the Liberal Party itself has been corrupted by the PRC's influence and rendered unto the Chinese state. I mean, the Foreign Interference Commission's landmark final report explicitly stated that the PRC has clandestinely leveraged Canadian officials in an effort to help its favorite candidates win office in 2019. And we've had various Liberal members of Parliament, such as Han Dong and Paul Chang, be forced to resign due to their own intimate relationship with the PRC and the Chinese Communist Party. And that's nothing to say of the Liberal Party's leadership, like Carney himself and Justin Trudeau, who was the PRC's favored leader for his tenure, right? And so I think very much if we want to stem this flow, well, our government, our governing party, is beholden to the PRC, and that's very much where we have to start. We have to excise the blight from essentially the top down, it seems, and from fundamental aspects of our political apparatus and system.
And kind of dovetailing off of that, the NSICOP report, which is now pretty famous, has talked about 11 parliamentarians that have willingly or unwillingly been collaborating with foreign states, specifically India and China, I think are some of the more talked about ones. And we've had chats with former CSIS senior leaders, such as Michelle Juno Katsuya, who has said that the number is actually over 50, past and present. So how do we move ahead and restore public confidence within our officials when we have these reports that are talking about these parliamentarians with these ties, but also try to maintain our rule of law of innocent until proven guilty? It's a delicate balance, isn't it?
It's definitely a delicate balance, but I think at least from the public's perception, you have to begin, right? You have to take the initial steps towards doing something about it. And I think that from the public's perspective, they haven't even started, right? Like I think that all of these officials, all of these people who were named in the report, for all we know, the majority of them have gone unbothered, right? And I think that one of the things that the Jamestown Foundation recently revealed is that we have nearly 5 times the per capita density of United Front organizations as the U.S. Right? That's crazy. And I think, like you said yourself, there's been almost a concerted effort across, let's say, the Liberal Party at least, to not discuss the problem, to not really admit that it's there. If you ask most Liberal supporters what did the report identify, they'd say, well, no interference at all, right? Or very little, or they tried, but they failed. But you have Commissioner Justice Marie-Josée Hogue herself saying that the PRC's acts of foreign interference are a stain on Canada's electoral process, right? But I think to most Canadians, they'd say that nothing has been done to wash it away.
And CSIS has been on record in parliamentary committee multiple times saying the best antidote to foreign interference is sunlight. But we then have liberals trying to come out and say that that's problematic because we have to consider national security and how our national security organizations actually gain this information through their sources. So what is it? Do we need sunlight? Do we have to err on the side of we say nothing to preserve our national security sources? Or do we actually have to get to some common sense and say, well, what's the point of gathering this information and protecting these sources if we're not actually going to do anything about it?
Oh, I agree with you 100%. And I think that this is probably one of the issues that's most concerning to Canadians is we identify these urgent issues and then we let them flounder and almost evaporate. I mean, the PRC has installed countless illegal police stations throughout Canada, and various politicians, it seems. And yet, if you ask our government what are they doing about it, they suddenly tell you it's not an issue. And I think that you have to look at stuff like Carney himself. We have the PRC disseminating favorable messages about him on WeChat, right? And even Carney himself kind of bizarrely declaring that the progress that Canada and the PRC have made in the new partnership sets him up well for the New World Order. It's just a very bizarre situation, and it does very much seem like, at least post Iran and Venezuela, China is consolidating its evil little network internationally in countries like Canada and South Korea, because, in my opinion, it has been very much forced to, given the fact that it has lost these two very important poles or states from its network.
And what are Canadians to think about Mark Carney's Davos speech, considering that his relationship and what he's doing with China blatantly contradicts it? Because in his Davos speech, he's trying to argue that the middling powers have to get together and they need to resist the dependency on hegemons. Yet we're essentially walking into the dragon's mouth, as it were, as we get closer and closer with China.
Well, I think that there's a huge disjunct between what Carney says and what Carney does. You know, I actually recently wrote an article, published an article called "Carney's Blarney," and Canada's economic collapse. In a way, I think that says it all, right? I think that he's a remorseless liar, and I think that he's quite happily commandeered the Canadian state towards his own profit, and very much sold out Canada's future, the future of the Canadian people, along with it, and happily so. I've heard him called an economic hitman and various other glowing terms. And I wouldn't necessarily disagree. I think that if we look at the way that Carney and the Liberal Party has functioned over the past year at least, we see that it's almost entirely selfishly oriented or kind of like towards its own personal gain. And I think that that's not an accident. I think that Carney is very much banking on being able to ride off into the sunset on the liberal status quo before anybody really recognizes what's afoot.